Bang! Knives Knives. I'm Jared. My lovely wife Kara's busy, and today we are talking about thin blade stocks. So knives with thin blades, and we are going to start off with a couple average knives, and then we are going to work our way down to the thinnest one. Now, there's a lot of knives that could have made it on this list. If there's one that you would have liked to have seen on this list, leave it down in the comments. And when we're talking about thin blades, we're talking about specifically the blade stock thickness, the thickest point, not behind the edge. Now, a lot of these knives in this list do have amazing blade geometry, but they're not necessarily thin behind the edge. But a thin blade stock will always cut and pass through materials better than a thick blade stock. It's the beginning of how good the blade geometry is going to be. So even if the blade is a little thicker behind the edge, being a thin blade stock, it's going to be able to cut a lot better than if it was thick. Now, you can have a knife that's very thin behind the edge, but has an incredibly thick blade stock that's not going to cut as good as a knife with a thinner blade stock that's a little thicker behind the edge. Because, and it usually depends, so I know there's variables, and there's going to be some circumstances where, a knife that's thick, that has a thick spine but's very thin behind the edge, might pass through materials a little bit better. But a lot of times when you have a really thick blade stock and it gets down to a thin edge, the material has to get over that shelf. The part where the blade, if it's a hollow grind, there's going to be a shelf at the top of that hollow. Or if it's a flat grind, it still has to get over that thickest part of the blade. So starting off with a very thin blade stock can be very important for very good slicers. Let's get into this. So this is the Microtech SOCOM Elite. This is not a thin blade stock. This is 190 thousandths thick. It is a very thick blade stock, and I will bring this back up here momentarily as we get to thinner blades. The Microtech SOCOM Elite, 190 thousandths. Next, this is a pretty standard average thickness for a lot of pocket knives, and this is the Civivi Victory. Now, the Civivi Victory's blade stock thickness is 150 thousandths, but this one actually has pretty decent geometry because most of the blade isn't 150 thousandths, even when we're talking about the spine. If you see this line right here, this is the part where the flipper tab is and all that, where it's 150 thousandths. All this, you see that it has a swedge up on top that's thinner than 150 thousandths, and even this part right here isn't quite 150 thousandths, but back here it is. But that's a pretty standard or pretty average thickness for a lot of pocket knives, 150 thousandths. Now, as we move along, we get to another very common thickness. This is the Spyderco PM2. And the Spyderco PM2 has a blade stock thickness of 145 thousandths. Now, it does taper, as you can see, from thicker to thinner. And it's not really thin behind the edge, but because it's a full flat grind, does help it cut a lot better than if it, wasn't a full flat grind. But the blade stock thickness on the PM2 is 145 thousandths. Next, we get to a Hinder 3-inch. Now, this is the XM18 3-inch at 140 thousandths thick blade stock. Now, just wait till you see what we pull up when we pull up the slip joint version of this knife. Watch how much thinner it is compared to the Hinder XM18 3-inch at 140 thousandths. Next, we get to the Spyderco Manix 2, 130 thousandths thick blade stock. So relatively thin. It's thinner than the PM2. It definitely has a little bit better geometry, and I personally love the way the Manix 2 cuts. This is an amazing cutter, amazing blade shape, and it just works for all your daily cutting needs really well. It just works so good. Great blade shape, and in my opinion, it has pretty good geometry. Now, just a little disclaimer, just because a blade stock is thicker than another blade doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be stronger or a thinner blade is going to be weaker. A lot of times it does, but sometimes it will boil down to the steel and the heat treat of which the blade is. So a thin blade will always cut better than a thicker blade, or at least for the most part. But for strength, there are a lot of other factors, but a lot of times a thicker blade is going to be stronger than a thinner blade, but you do have to take into account the steel and the heat treat. Now we're getting to the thin blades. Now for the rest of this is all, in my opinion, starting to be considered thin blades. We have the WII Vapor at 125 thousandths. Now, another beautiful thing about this, a lot like the knife we were talking about before, the thickest part is all back here. So all of this is actually thinner than that. You can actually see the taper this way, and even the thickest point right here where you see the swedge going across right here, that line, that's less than 125 thousandths. So since it's a tall, deep, hollow ground blade, it's very thin behind the edge and a thin blade stock, which makes this thing a very, very good cutter. It's a very slicey blade. And also right now at Knife Center, you can find these for $155 or something like that, which is $100 cheaper than we bought this one just a couple of years ago. These things were originally $250. So for $150, that is a very good deal for this. S35VN, it has like a Cerakote finish. I'm not sure if it's Cerakote or ceramic coating, but it's a baked on coating that's very, very durable. They also have other versions with blacked out blades and, you know, plain titanium stone washed, but it has a beautiful carbon fiber insert, carbon fiber backspacer, titanium clip, all the bells and whistles. Yeah, definitely a great value there for the $156. Next, we have the Civivi Picaro, 120 thousandths. Now, so the beautiful thing about this is that it is also a 4-inch blade at 120 thousandths blade stock thickness. It's already starting off with a very thin blade stock, and it has a nice deep, tall hollow grind, nice and thin behind the edge. I think it's about 15 thousandths behind the edge, and it's a long blade, and since it's so thin, you can get flex out of it, which is okay in my opinion, because this knife is made to be a mega slicer, and it is. This thing, you have plenty of reach, so when you're cutting cardboard or when you're slicing, you could do repeat cuts very easily, and you never have to worry about running out of blade. And it passes through materials very nicely with 120 thousandths thick blade stock. Very, very nice. The Civivi Picaro. Now, a couple more knives from Civivi that are also 120 thousandths, because they have a lot of knives in the 120 thousandths. The Civivi Elementum, a well-known Civivi, very popular, and also the Civivi button lock Elementum. Both have 120 thousandths thick blade stock. Now this is the D2 version. This is the 14C28M version. But because they are a thin blade stock with a nice, beautiful hollow ground blade, very thin behind the edge, great blade shape, these things work great. They cut very well. You have a lot of life out of them when sharpening because they have a hollow grind. And yeah, it's a great thickness and geometry for an everyday carry knife. Now, you can say the next Civivi Elementum, the version in S35VN, it's actually thinner than the D2 version or the button lock version. This version in S35VN is actually only 100 thousandths thick, and you can see the difference in the blade stock there. So The S35VN version being 100 thousandths thick, it's thinner. It makes the handle thinner, and that is a thing, you know, and not always, but a lot of times when you have a thin blade, you're going to get more of a compact handle. Not always. It just depends. But in this case, it definitely is, and it makes the Elementum an even better version of, or an even better cutter, a better slicer, and even better geometry for everyday carry. So you could say the S35VN version not only has better geometry, but also a better steel. Also at 100 thousandths, the Hilti Slippy. I did not know, I never knew that the Hilti slip joint was a thinner blade than the regular 3-inch version that's at 140 thousandths. So you can see how much thinner this version is, the slip joint version is, compared to the locking version. Both are basically the same knife, just one's a slip joint and one's a frame lock, but this one comes with a lot thinner blade stock, so it is going to pass through materials better than this version, which is going to be a little stronger. Next, the WII Kitefin, another one at 100 thousandths. Very thin, beautiful, beautiful hollow ground blade, very useful blade shape as well, and nice and compact, very thin, handle, so nice and compact, very light, and even though there isn't any milling on these titanium scales, because it's a more compact knife, it still has a very, very light weight to it. And yeah, this is such a great cutter with 100 thousandths thick blade stock. All right, now we're moving on down. The Benchmade Bugout, 90 thousandths thick. Now this is an example of where the knife is not very thin behind the edge. But because it has such a thin blade stock, it makes it pass through materials very easily. So this knife, even though it's not crazy thin behind the edge, it's a very good cutter because the blade stock is so thin. So instead of making it very thin behind the edge, they made it just a little bit thicker behind the edge. It's still good. It's still good geometry, but that way they can make it a little stronger while also being able to slice very good. So you're getting a good medium range there between strength and cutting performance. The Benchmade Bugout. Oh, this version, it has the RC Blade Works micarta scales, burlap micarta scales, very, very lightweight. Next up, another one at 90 thousandths. The Quiet Carry Waypoint, very thin blade stock and a nice thin hollow ground blade, and I just put my fingerprints on it. But unlike this one, where they went for a little bit more of a strength in the blade, this one they went for more cutting performance. So this one actually is thinner behind the edge, which I love. And it has, you know, a nice hollow grind, so you're going to be able to sharpen it multiple times without it ever getting thicker behind the edge. Great EDC knife, LC200N liners, titanium scales. It is basically a corrosion-proof knife, so you do not have to worry about corrosion or rust or anything like that. Van Eyck steel, an amazing, amazing steel that does not rust. And yeah, great, great knife. Very thin blade stock, so the cutting performance is outstanding with that knife. Another one, actually another two, we have the TRM Atom and the TRM Shadow, both TRM knives. And I'm not sure if TRM always have all their blades are 90 thousandths, but my two versions are 90 thousandths thick, the blade stock, very thin blades, and nice tall flat grinds. So it makes these cut so incredibly well. It's such a thin blade stock, and it's not crazy thin behind the edge. I mean, it's still nice and thin, but it's not like crazy thin. But because it's such a tall flat grind with a thin blade, it really passes through materials very, very well. Same thing with the Atom. Just a great, great example of a thin blade for EDC. That's a great blade shape for all your tasks, and winds up cutting extremely, extremely well. And by keeping it just a little bit thicker behind the edge, they kept a little bit more strength in the blade. Now another one at 90 thousandths would be the Kershaw Leak hollow ground blade. Now this is another example of where they didn't go crazy thin behind the edge, but they still put a hollow ground blade. So you can get multiple sharpenings out of this before it ever gets thicker, but it will always have that very thin blade stock to make it cut extremely well. Very popular knife. This is supposed to be an assisted knife. Mine's de-assisted, but a very, very good knife, especially a great starter knife. Heck, it's a great knife just all around. The Kershaw Leak. Now, for the last but not least, 78 thousandths blade stock thickness, the Spyderco Chaparral. The Spyderco Chaparral is a compact little knife, but even though it is such a compact little knife, you can get a full grip on it because of this finger choil, and look at that blade stock thickness. Now let's bring back the Microtech and look at the difference here in thickness. Holy cow. Look at that. So that is why this is going to pass through material so much better than something like this. And this is thin behind the edge. I think these are like 15 thousandths behind the edge. So relatively good geometry, but since it dramatically drops from such a thick blade stock down to such a thin blade, and you can really see how thin it gets right there. Yes, it's going to have the best cutting performance it can have, but not as good as something with a thinner blade stock that's a little thicker behind the edge. And this, at least in these examples. But yeah, this is such an amazing little knife. Great blade shape. It's great as just a little pocket knife that definitely works above its pay grade, I guess you could say. Super useful, super compact, super light, and man, does it work. And it carries like nothing. It almost seems like you don't even have a knife in your pocket, but dang it, does it work great. And with the CTS XHP steel, I do love that steel. You do want to watch out for corrosion on it, but good steel and good geometry for sure with this very thin blade stock at 78 thousandths. There you guys go. I didn't bring up any slip joints. These were all locking knives. Slip joints, I know, can be incredibly, incredibly thin, but I thought it was a fun video. I love you guys. Peace.